The first sign that the desert was about to test a man's soul was not a shout or a gunshot. It was a dark ribbon of blood drying across pale dust, leading straight to the old stone ring of a ranch well. Arizona, 1847, hard land, hard people, and a sky so wide it could swallow a life without a ripple. Jesse Hartwell had asked very little from that sky. He mended fences, rode his boundaries, and let silence do most of the talking. Wind and grit had worn down the edges of his days until they fit neat and plain. But that afternoon, the piece he'd carved out for himself cracked. Slumped against the well rock was a young Apache warrior, breath shallow, eyes dull with pain, reaching with a shaky hand toward a wooden bucket just out of reach. A fresh bullet had torn into his side. In a place set on fear and fury, a wounded native on a white ranch was usually the start of 2 funerals. Neighbors would have dragged the boy off by his hair and called it justice. Plenty would have clapped Jesse on the back for helping them do it. Yet when Jesse met the stranger's gaze, he didn't see an enemy. He saw thirst. He saw a person trying to live 1 minute more. So he did the thing most folks would call foolish. He hauled up water and tipped it to the young man's lips. That simple mercy would pull him into a storm he never meant to ride. The warrior was not just any rider from the hills. His name was Teo, son of Chief Waya, the respected leader whose word had steadied the hands on both sides of a fragile peace. Teo wasn't known for raiding or fire. He was known for his voice. It was Teo who had stood at Fort Richardson and helped set down a treaty after 3 years of blood and grief. He was a rare kind on the frontier, a fighter who could stop a fight with reason. But peace doesn't make some men rich. In the territory, certain hands hidden behind titles had found ways to turn war into profit, selling rifles to lawless bands, feeding rumors, stirring up fear, making sure the gun smoke never truly cleared. Teo had followed the wrong trail too late. He'd been called to meet Colonel Merritt Ashford to grow the treaty south. Instead, he walked into a trap. Ashford was shot dead. Teo took a bullet at close range. The killers painted the scene to look like Apache savagery, then sent the story galloping. Teo the assassin, Teo the traitor, Teo to be hunted down. By the time he stumbled into Jesse's yard, he carried more than a wound. He carried the truth that could save the treaty, or snap it in half. Jesse knew exactly what it meant to help him. He also knew what it meant not to. He lifted Teo under the arms and got him inside. He boiled water, tore strips from a clean shirt, packed the wound, and kept his voice low and steady. Teo didn't beg and didn't complain. Between breaths, he gave Jesse a name and a warning. Lawmen were coming. Not all of them served the law. One in particular had dirt baked into his badge, Marshal Clay Webb, a man with a talent for violence and a hunger for power. Webb had orders, or said he did, to bring Teo in. They could hang the rest on paper later. Jesse's heartbeat walked the fence between fear and resolve. He had lived 12 quiet years under the sun, doing enough to get by and not enough to be noticed. Now, with a steady drip of Teo's blood tapping like a clock on his floorboards, he understood that quiet could be another word for looking away. Teo's voice was thin but certain. Colonel Ashford had left a letter the night before he died. A letter that named names, traced bribes, tied military men and marshals to gun runners who fed on chaos. The paper itself was smudged with blood and dust. Its words were clear. If Teo lived to speak before the Apache Council and the fort, the crooked would be stripped bare. If he died, men who dressed themselves in honor would keep filling their pockets with gold. Jesse listened, throat tight. He didn't argue. He didn't say the world was complicated. He looked at Teo's face and made the only call he could live with. He would hide him for as long as the sun took to circle once. He didn't get that long. Webb rode up before the coffee went cold. 6 deputies came with him, rifles across their thighs, eyes sharp and mean. Dust hung around them like a halo of trouble. Webb's smile was thin as a knife. He asked routine questions with a voice that said he already had his answers. Blood by the well. Strange tracks. Any visitors? Jesse stood in his doorway with his shoulders set. He said he'd seen no one but coyotes and quail. He said the blood came from a buck that leapt the fence and tangled in wire. Webb's gaze slid past him to the dim room beyond. Funny, he said, how often wounded bucks drag themselves inside a man's house. His pistol hand twitched like it had its own ideas. Jesse felt the world balance on a thread. That was when Teo spoke from the shadowed bed, his words steady as a stake in hard ground. He told them his name and the truth. He was named Fort Richardson. He was named Colonel Ashford. He named the men whose pockets had grown fat on other people's grief. He told Webb he knew the games they played and how many died to keep them going. One of the deputies, barely older than 20, flinched and glanced at Webb. The boy's name was Noah Carter. His jaw worked like he was chewing something tough. The blood-marked letter came out from beneath a blanket. Jesse held it up, not like a weapon, but like a mirror. "You want the law," he said quietly. "This is the law talking." Webb's face changed. It wasn't anger first, it was fear. Then the anger came fast to hide it. He barked for his men to spread out. Boots thumped on Jesse's porch. Rifles lifted. Noah Carter didn't move right away. He looked at the letter again, then at Teo, then at Webb. The air was a match waiting for a strike. Teo began to sing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't challenge. It was an old call, a sound from before any white post had been dug into Apache ground. The notes rose and fell like wind over long grass. Jesse didn't know the words. He knew what they meant. Within minutes, the earth answered. Hoofbeats rolled like a drumline across the hardpan. Shadows crested the ridges and poured down, not a mob, not a raid. Warriors, 50 at least, rode in formation and took their places in a wide circle around the house. No screaming, no shots, just a presence of power and sorrow and patience. Chief Waya himself dismounted, age and grit etched into his face, eyes deep with years that had seen too much. He walked forward without hurry, laid a hand on Teo's shoulder, and looked once at Jesse with something like thanks. Jesse's porch had never held so much breath. He stepped out into the light with his hands open and his rifle down. Webb drew in enough air to swell his chest and shouted about harboring criminals, about the governor, about rights and warrants. His voice bounced off stone and died there. Wyatt did not look at him. Jesse did. "Marshal," Jesse said, "we can all stand here waving paper at the sky, or we can listen to a man who almost died for a treaty that saves children and old folks, and anyone who doesn't have a gun in his hand." Webb snarled something about savages and lies. Noah Carter's rifle barrel dipped. Teo told it all, unbroken. He told how Ashford had called for a meeting to widen the peace, and had been shot instead. He told how men wearing feathers they hadn't earned had mocked his people's voice to hide white men's greed. He told how gold slid into pockets while mothers wept. He spoke to the deputies as if Webb wasn't there, and each word loosened another nail in the false wall Webb had built. The letter passed from Jesse to Noah to 2 other deputies. Fingers traced names that had seemed too far away to be real. When Teo finished, the only sound for a moment was the soft stamp of a horse far down the circle. Then it snapped. Webb lunged for his gun and turned it toward Chief Waya's chest. Jesse didn't think. He hit Webb mid-draw, and they went over the rail, in a tangle that knocked the breath from both. The pistol skittered, bounced twice, and stopped at Noah Carter's boot. Noah picked it up. He did not hand it back. Webb swore and swung at Jesse's jaw. Jesse tasted copper and threw him off. 2 deputies who had been Webb's men a minute earlier grabbed their boss by the elbows. "Enough," Noah said, voice shaking but clear. "This isn't the way." Guns lowered like rain easing off a tin roof. The Apache ring did not tighten. It was held. Jesse stood, chest heaving, and wiped blood from his lip with the back of his wrist. He looked at Webb and saw a man who had believed no line could stop him. He looked at Noah and saw someone choosing one. The young deputy lifted the letter high. "By this," he said, "we're suspending pursuit until a full hearing at Fort Richardson." It wasn't a grand speech. It didn't need to be. Authority spread out from those words like heat. What came after felt both quiet and huge. Webb was disarmed and set under guard by the very men who had ridden in as his teeth. 2 deputies who still clung to him by habit backed away when they met Wya's eyes. Teo eased himself up on one elbow and nodded to Jesse in a way that said a dozen things at once. Gratitude, relief, a promise that hard work was still ahead. The sun slid down the sky, and shadows reached for the porch steps. Wya stepped close to Jesse and placed both hands on his shoulders. He spoke in Apache with a weight that made Jesse stand straighter without meaning to. Teo translated, voice-catching. You saw a man, not a mask. You chose mercy when fear was easier. Today, you are our brother. It was not a show for the crowd. It was a moment between people who had walked through fire. One by one, riders, boys fresh to manhood and men with hair gone to silver, came forward. They didn't grab Jesse's hand and pump it like a deal. They touched his hand lightly, palms meeting for the space of a breath. A simple gesture, reverent and final. At the end, Chief Wya brought out a lance older than any man present, its shaft wrapped in leather and beadwork, its feathers whispering in the evening air. It had never passed to anyone outside their people. He set it in Jesse's hands. It was not a gift for killing. It was a mark of kinship and trust, a sign that the line they had just held together might hold again. By sunset, the ranch felt changed, even in the shape of its shadows. Webb and his last loyal deputy sat bound, not beaten, waiting for dawn and a road to the fort, where paper and witness would do the slow work of justice. Teo rested, breath steadying. The circle of riders opened enough to let the night breeze through. Coyotes called in the distance like nothing at all had happened, because the desert keeps its own clock. Jesse stood at his fence, shirt stuck to his back, aches blooming where fists had found him, and let the orange edge of the day lay across his yard. 24 hours earlier, he was a man who wanted to be left alone. Now he could not remember how that ever felt like a plan. He had given water to a stranger. He had stepped between a pistol and a chief. He had chosen to believe a voice that power wanted to silence. He did not feel like a hero. He felt tired and oddly light, as if a weight he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it had slid off without a sound. When full darkness came, there were no victory songs. There were only small fires, soft words, and the sound of horses pulling at the sparse grass. Jesse hung the lance above his hearth because he didn't know where else to put something that large and that important. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the empty space where fear used to stand and tell him what to do. He thought of tomorrow, the ride to Fort Richardson, the faces of officers trying to hide their guilt, the slow grind of right trying to catch wrong. He thought of children running in a yard without shame. He thought of cost and knew he would pay it again. Outside, the desert cooled and the stars came out bright and unblinking, as if to say the world had, for once, tilted a little toward mercy. The dawn came pale and quiet, as if the desert itself was holding its breath after the long night. Jesse Hartwell stepped out to the fence line with the lance Chief Wya had placed in his hands and felt the weight of it press meaning into his palms. Across the yard, Marshal Clay Webb sat bound beside his last loyal man, eyes red with anger and fear, the kind that comes when a story a man told himself for years finally stops believing him back. Teo was stronger by morning, color returning slow to his face, his bandage clean, his voice steady. The circle of riders opened to let the sun spill in, and the first sounds of the day, horses snorting, canteens sloshing, leather creaking, felt like a promise that what they had held together at dusk would reach the fort at noon. They rode in 2 columns, Apache and deputies, and one stubborn rancher who had never planned to be anyone's bridge, dust lifting beneath them like smoke from a slow fire. Fort Richardson rose from the plain stern as ever. High walls, neat rows, the tight rhythm of boots. But even from a distance, Jesse could tell something had shifted. Children ran laughing near the yard, white and Apache together, kicking up dust and shouting names in both tongues. That sight alone put iron in his spine. At the gate, Colonel Hiram Stokes met them with a face made for rules and a grip that surprised Jesse with its warmth. He listened to Noah Carter lay out the facts and studied the blood-stained letter as if each word were a nail he meant to drive straight. Stokes ordered Webb disarmed and confined without grand speeches, then told Jesse, Teo, and Chief why the council chamber was waiting. Inside, representatives from 5 Apache bands sat across from soldiers and officials, the room thick with old pain and new chances. Teo took his seat like a man who had walked through fire and come back with a bucket. Jesse stood at his shoulder, not as a warrior or a politician, but as the man who had knelt beside a stranger and tipped a dipper of water when everyone else would have turned away. The debates began hard and careful. Some settlers wanted wider grazing. Some tribal leaders said not one more inch would be traded, for a paper promise men might forget the second they smelled profit. The air carried memory, raids, reprisals, funerals with too few words, and it mixed with fear of what could return if they blinked. Jesse waited until the talk felt like wheels stuck in sand, then spoke, not in terms or maps, but in story. He told them about the trail of blood across his yard, about a hand reaching toward a bucket, about the choice a man makes when no one is watching. He told them how a marshal's badge can shine while the hand that wears it hides rot, how a letter written before a good man died can carry more truth than a dozen uniforms lined up in a row, how a song can call riders not to slaughter, but to stand in the open and let truth do the heavy lifting. He kept it simple, because the right things are often simple when you strip off pride. You can write every rule you want, he said, voice steady, but if folks in the dirt don't see it lived, the paper won't hold. Teo nodded once, the small kind of nod that says a man has heard his own heart in someone else's mouth. The room changed by degrees the way a chill lifts when the sun gets high enough to find every corner. By dusk, the council voted to widen the treaty, shared grazing where the land could bear it, trading rights watched by both sides, regular meets to check the edges for men who would profit if any of this fell apart. They wrote a title for Jesse he never asked for and barely knew how to carry. Liaison, a plain word for a hard task, named by both Fort Richardson and the Apache Council to stand in the gap where trust goes thin. He took it because turning it down felt smaller than the work ahead. That evening, they lit a fire just outside the walls. Warriors and soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, swapping stories in short lines and long silences, passing tin cups and breaking bread that tasted better because it wasn't eaten alone. Chief Wyeth spoke soft, a voice worn smooth by use. In our tongue, he told Jesse, through Teo's translation, we have no word for enemy that doesn't come from fear. Yesterday, you helped us remember fear can be taught and untaught. Jesse looked into the flames and let the truth warm his bones. I didn't do anything special, he said. I saw a man who needed water. Teo smiled the kind of small smile that means more than laughter. That is exactly why it was special, he said. Because you had no reason to, except that it was right. The next weeks moved like a wagon on a rutted road. Slow in places, faster once certain bumps were leveled. Webb faced charges not just for one act, but for a web of them, each strand tied to names on Colonel Ashford's page. Men who had hidden behind titles found themselves pulled into light. Some blustered, some begged. A few ran and were fetched back by riders who now worked together in ways no one had thought possible 6 months earlier. News carried across the territory in tight lines tapped on wire and in longer lines told on porches at dusk. People heard about a white rancher who had stood between a pistol and a chief, about a young deputy who decided a badge served truth, not the man who wore it, about warriors who came when called and kept the peace by showing their faces, not their fury. Trade posts began to feel different, eyes softer, hands slower to drift near a holster, greetings offered without flinching. In Cedar Ridge, a teacher propped a slate on a barrel and taught numbers in English in the morning and words for river and sky in Apache in the afternoon, and no one walked out. In another town, a fence line that had sparked 3 fights in 2 months was walked by both sides together with a string and a handshake. None of it felt like a miracle. It felt like work. It felt like men and women choosing, one small thing at a time, to live the treaty they had signed. Jesse went home after the council with a letter carrying official words and a simple task. Keep standing where storms like to form. He hung the lance above his hearth, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that kindness is a tool you carry every day, like a good knife or a length of rope. When he rode out to talk through a grazing dispute, he wore no uniform but the dust on his coat and the honest crease in his brow. When he sat with families who had lost someone in the old fighting, he didn't offer easy answers. He offered time. He listened. He let grief be loud and then quiet. And he didn't take offense when anger needed a place to land before it could lift. He met Noah Carter now, and then on the trail. The young deputy stood taller these days in a way that had nothing to do with inches. He didn't swagger. He didn't lecture. He just did his job with clean lines. Once, Noah asked Jesse if he ever wished he'd kept to himself. Jesse looked out at a line of mesquite and said, "Silence keeps a man safe until the day it doesn't." 6 months after the morning that changed everything, Jesse returned to the fort in his best shirt, hat in his hand, not for praise, but to make sure the words on the page had hands under them. The yard was different again, less stiffness, more life. On the steps, Colonel Stokes greeted him with that same firm grip. "Peacekeeper," he said with a half-smile. Jesse shook his head. "Jesse is fine. Peacekeeper sounds like a man too important to mend his own fence." Stokes laughed and waved him inside. The new council moved faster, Trust having found a few more footholds. They laid out shared patrols along the rough borders, where raiders still tested the seams. They swapped names of traitors who played fair and those who didn't. They set a schedule for meetings that would hold men to their word by the simple trick of seeing one another often enough that lies got tired. When the work was done, they built another fire under a sky spiked with stars. Jesse sat between Teo and Chief Waya and let the quiet do what quiet does when it belongs to friends. The chief leaned over and said something Jesse carried home like a coin in his pocket. Peace is not the land. It is the tracks we lay across it and the feet that keep walking them. On the ride back, the road stretched long and familiar. Jesse did not rush. He wanted to feel each mile the way a man fingers a string of beads, marking prayers. He thought of the day he had found Teo by the well, of the heat on his neck, of the lightning-fast choice that had not felt like a choice at all. He thought of the look in Teo's eyes now, clear, alive, reflective. He thought of the children he had seen at the fort chasing each other in a game with no sides. He thought of Webb in a cell, paging through the seconds of a life spent bending truth until it broke him back. He thought of all the small turns between those points and of how easy it would have been to step aside and let someone else carry them. At his ranch, the lance still hung over the hearth, catching morning light. Travelers who passed through sometimes noticed it and asked for the story. Jesse told it plain, without polishing himself into something shiny. He talked about a bucket of water, a song, a circle of riders holding their fire, a letter written by a man who knew he wouldn't see the sunrise, a deputy choosing to do the right thing exactly once and finding he wanted to do it again the next day. He told how compassion doesn't ask for permission, it asks for courage. Older folks who had seen too much nodded like they recognized an old friend. Younger ones leaned forward like they were hearing news that might matter to their own days. When he finished, he always said the same line, simple and true. Kindness looks small until you count what it stops. Years from that first morning, the story kept traveling. Some people made Jesse bigger than he was. He let them if it helped the lesson stick. Others argued about details. He didn't argue back. He went on mending fence, checking water, riding into town with a list of nails, salt, and coffee. He showed up when asked, stood aside when not, and kept his door open wide enough that a man in trouble could still fit through it carrying his pride. In a land that had once believed the only way forward was through the sound of gunfire, folks began to understand that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is put down a fear and pick up a cup. If you find yourself listening to this and wondering whether your best days are behind you, hear this the way Jesse learned it. The most important work is often the quiet kind that asks you to see the person in front of you and act like their life weighs as much as your own. You don't need a badge, a title, or a crowd to clap. You need a clear eye, a steady hand, and the will to do one small right thing when it would be easier to do nothing. That's how a treaty holds. That's how a town softens. That's how a desert, unforgiving as it is, gives back a little shade. And that's how a rancher with a bucket of water and a stubborn streak helped turn a place built on fear into a place that, piece by piece, chose to be brave.